everything we've learned over the course of the day, what does this mean going forward? The next panel will be moderated by Rob Zitz, who has 30 years of experience in the Intel community and currently is at SAIC. Looking forward in the future, we were just talking about what that really means and what the most important stuff could be. He's expecting 3 grandchildren coming up here in the near term, and so that's a really important thing looking forward. Thank you, guys. Take it away.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, we want to get down to what the real priorities here. I've got one two-year-old grandchild now and 2 on the way, so that's the real deal, because what we're going to be talking about here, of course, is the human condition. This is what we've been talking about all day long, and it's about connecting. Now, before making a couple of brief remarks about the future, I want to introduce our distinguished panelists. Let's go from starting closest to me, to my right, Lou Martinage, who is with Microstrategy. He's responsible for alert applications and social media there. He's got a deep background in the communications sector, electronics engineering, and computer science. Sitting next to Lou is Rand Waltzman, who is from DARPA. His background is in advanced software techniques, including image processing, understanding machine-to-machine intelligence, computational physics. He's also at DARPA working on advanced understanding of social media and its impact on strategic communications. Next to Rand is Patrick Meier, who's the Director of Crisis Mapping at Ushahidi. He's also the co-founder of Crisis Mappers Network. Now, we were asked to come and talk about the future. So you say, all right, we're at the end of the day, it's a Friday, and we're going to try to predict the future. What a great assignment. My first reaction was, there's one thing that I can say for sure about the future, and that is in about 3 hours, 1/3 of this crowd will be tipping a bottle back at the happy hour, wherever you choose to do that. I'm pretty sure about that prediction. Beyond that, it gets a little sketchy. Let's face it, who would have predicted the kinds of capabilities, the technologies, or where we are today? Who would have predicted these things even 10 years ago, much less further out? But what we're supposed to do is talk about trends in technology, talk about trends in socioeconomics, talk about trends in commerce and commercial use of these technologies, and we'll do that. Now, it's clear that there are going to be changes, and there's going to be effects from those changes, but what could those be? I want to give you just sort of a sketch framework that'll help us as we move through this hour. Everybody's familiar with Moore's Law. Well, Moore's Law also applies to communications and bandwidth, ability to move bits around. We think we can move things around quickly, but imagine, if you will, a future where the typical user to their handheld has got tens of gigs, hundreds of gigs, maybe thousands of gigs worth of data coming to them at that speed per second. Think about nanotechnologies and user interfaces. Today, we're very impressed with what we have with our Apple iPhone and how these devices seem to be getting smaller and smaller. But we're also today in various communities, user communities, already moving data to people's goggles so they can have, if you will, a heads-up display and have some augmented reality, if not virtual reality. We know that DARPA, one of our panelists is from DARPA, DARPA has announced this week that they're working on small contact lenses that would be implanted on an individual's eye, and that you would be able to actually see the information, that the augmented reality on your contact lens as you're in the environment. We see and hear about people talking about implants, and so that you move away from having to have your hands encumbered or your ears encumbered and actually be able to have the information beamed to you, and so on as you think about user interface. You think about speed. Well, we talked about communication speed, but there's also processing speed. Moore's Law applies to processing speeds. And so the ability to have information be able to then turn into something meaningful, to derive meaning from chaos, that becomes, I won't say easier, but more and more available as processing speeds continue to climb. As part of that, there's the next generation of algorithms or approaches to do data extraction, data manipulation. We're seeing an evolution from assisted processing to automated to we believe will be autonomous. So what are the kinds of things that one might expect to see happen in various categories if that is a future? Well, let's talk about political discourse. We've been hearing about that today and how these social media capabilities have helped with political discourse. I want to walk you through some categories and say that, as an example, it can help or it might hurt. For example, with political discourse, it can empower citizens or could be used for propaganda. How about in the health arena? You can have better informed patients with targeted treatments, or you might have some who are using the information to screen for preconditions that would then prevent one's hiring or one's acceptance into something that they're desiring to do. How about safety? We've heard today about how we can aid first responders. There was a story in the last few weeks about a woman who was being abducted. She actually used her Facebook account to let people know this was happening, who then turned to police and first responders who rescued her. So you can aid and you can empower first responders, or this could enable predators who then put your safety at risk. In the intelligence and counterintelligence arena, this can aid friendly governments, or it can aid those who are wanting to do harm. Think about what happened in India a few years ago, where a group of terrorists used GPS technologies, used web-enabled technologies, used handheld devices, used the web to keep situation awareness themselves as they carried out their nefarious acts. How about romance? Social media can help to connect lonely people, or might drive up the divorce rate, depending on how much you're on the social media. Commerce. We'll hear some today about where we're going with commercial capabilities and how commerce is going to use this information. This social media can improve and simplify a consumer's life. I'll tell you, I hardly go shopping anymore at Christmas. I could do it all on Amazon.com and it comes right to my doorstep. It can improve and simplify the consumer's life. Or is it encouraging unnecessary consumption? Disaster relief. It can be immeasurably improving our ability to respond to humanitarian needs, and we'll hear more about that in our panel. Or it can enable killers to pick their targets, to navigate to them, to understand them, and to counteract any first response. So the question is, will the future of social media make things better, or will it make things worse? I'd like to have our panelists come up and give their presentations, and then we'll have a robust question and answer period.
Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making the time this afternoon, and I'll try to keep my remarks fairly brief. I'm with Microstrategy. We are located in Tyson's Corner, headquartered there, and are a business intelligence company. Been around for about 20 years, and our core business is about working with organizations, and those could be enterprise organizations, agencies, you name it, helping them analyze their data. You know, from databases that could be located all over the world, aggregating that data together, and then analyzing it so you can derive some insight and take some action. So we're very familiar with big data and the trends towards more and more data and how to digest it and make it useful. A couple of years ago, we also dove into the mobile space. And of course, mobile is the core, the catalyst, if you will, to me anyway, of social media. It lets people become publishers anywhere, anytime. For us, it's about disseminating information. Those same insights we glean from our analysis, we can now deliver to hundreds of people in an organization via their iPhones or iPads or Android devices. So putting information to work instantaneously. And of course, more recently, we've taken a step into social media. And we are certainly not a social media outlet. We're not trying to be a Facebook or a Twitter or a YouTube. What we're doing is looking at ways that the we can build interesting applications using some of the data, the consumer data, that gets captured by these social networks. And in particular, I'll be talking in depth about Facebook. So I'll share with you a little bit about what we're doing there without getting too down in the weeds about our product. So I think we all know about Facebook. Recently, they minted probably 1,000 millionaires. There's also rapidly about 1 billion people on Facebook. I think it's official numbers, about 850 million. So that's 1 billion eyeballs generally spending an hour a day on Facebook, talking to their social network. That's unbelievable. It's 2 or 3 times the population of the United States. If you want to reach people, if you have fans, if you have constituents, if you're someone in politics and you want to influence people, you got to be on Facebook. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And the conventional ways of interacting with Facebook, you can see up here on the screen, obviously advertising. Facebook provides mechanisms for organizations or advertisers to do very targeted advertising, segmenting down to certain demographics, and their ads will pop up on your Facebook wall. Perhaps more interestingly, if you are a brand or a government agency or entity or even a celebrity, is that you can create a page on Facebook. And essentially your billboard. You can go plant your flag in the Facebook cloud, put up a big billboard where you can put your message out to 1 billion eyeballs or pairs of eyeballs. And that's a marketing nirvana. I have all these eyeballs with my message. Some of those people can become fans of me. And if they do that, I then have a relationship with them where what I post on my wall will show up on their news feeds. So I have a broadcast, one-way messaging system to potentially hundreds of millions of people. Of course, there's a downside to that as well, and that same billboard is actually a two-way billboard, and your fans can comment and share on your site as well. And oftentimes, when people take the time to do that, it's not a happy thing. They're usually complaining about something. So that's where the whole era of sentiment monitoring has come in for brands and organizations. What is the buzz about me out in the social network? And that being more than just Facebook. Facebook public posting, Twitter, YouTube, the press, television. What's the buzz? And what can I do to, if it's negative, turn that around? And a lot of discussions here today focused kind of on sentiment analysis and what's the buzz, what's going on, what's the momentum out there. But there's some hidden value that perhaps we haven't talked about, and that's about what lies inside the cloud. Inside the Facebook cloud is a wealth of consumer information. In fact, you could argue that the Facebook database is the world's largest aggregation of consumer likes and sentiment and interests ever, and it's refreshed on a daily basis as people engage with Facebook. So it's the freshest, largest set of data in the history of mankind. So what could we do with it, assuming we could get at it? So think of the potential. Concept of the universal registry. So organizations today spend millions of dollars trying to track their constituents, maintain a mailing list, names, addresses, marital status, job title, and that information is constantly changing. So most loyalty programs are full of holes and are never up to snuff. But there's one place that tracks when your status changes, when you get married, when you move, when your job title changes, and that's Facebook. So wouldn't it be powerful if organizations could somehow synchronize or connect into that underlying Facebook information? And beyond that, there's demographic available. I don't know if I just did that. Thank you. There's demographic information as well. So I can learn about my fan base, certainly ages, ethnicity, marital status, and potentially slice and dice that information in interesting ways. The social graph, also embedded in that Facebook cloud, or who your friends are, how often you post, how active you are you an influencer? Are you a consumer of information? Are you popular? It's all hidden away. And along with the interest graph. What are the things you like? Where do you check in? What books do you read? What shows do you watch? This will continue to get more interesting in the future as Facebook adds more active data sets, if you will, so that, and you probably see some of it already on your feed, on your page, where you can see what your friends are listening to, or what they're reading, or what they've watched. Can be somewhat irritating, but that's all getting stored away inside the cloud and can paint an increasingly more detailed picture of every consumer. So what could you do if you had all of this? Well, certainly the universal registry is interesting, I think, for, again, any organization with a following. And certainly, I think, government organizations, if I were running for office, I sure would love to have a up-to-date contact list for all my constituents, all my fans. So the opportunity to synchronize enterprise or organizational systems with Facebook and have your Facebook ID be kind of the universal identifier. One could create what we call here friendly applications. Friendly meaning they're keyed off of social information. They work based on your Facebook ID and your friends, sort of your own circle of trust. And if we think into the future, I could potentially use Facebook ID and my Facebook circle of trust as to set the boundaries for certain applications. I could create a friendly money transfer application, where I could pick friends in my Facebook universe, digitally send them money, and all the contact information, all the credentials are embedded in the data already. I could also use the same concept for gating access to certain events. I could throw big parties here in Washington, D.C. and use an application. In fact, we had one in the back called Usher to help control ticketing. Who gets to come? I can pick certain Facebook friends. They automatically get invited. When they show up, I can use those Facebook credentials to clear them to enter or not enter. And I could extend that concept further to admission into facilities, secure facilities, and so on. Of course, I can take that the next level and add demographic information. If I'm able to segment my user population and into tighter and tighter groups, I could potentially reach out to people in a more meaningful, personalized way. I can send content to men and women. I could then cut that up by age group, by location, by interest, by how much money they have, by how influential they are. So there's incredible amount of power, latent potential inside the social network. And of course, I could take action. Once I've learned about these different segments of my fan base, I could find out interesting affinities about them and put two and two together and create interesting outreach or campaigns. Some of those could be transactional in nature. For instance, I know you're an outdoor enthusiast, and so I'll put a special deal to you to get you to come on my canoe trip in return for coming into my store for a couple hours. I might also just send information that's just much more relevant to you, much more interesting, and create an enhanced loyalty experience. So there's a lot you can learn, and if you could theoretically see this screen, which I'm sure you cannot, this is output from a free application we developed called Wisdom. It's public, and what it is an app that goes out to people and anyone who downloads the app. It's purely to aggregate information and reflect it back to users, and you can filter it and sort it any way you like. And you can see some of the output here, if you could see it. We've got about 2.1 million fans represented in this analysis, and it shows age bracket, status, gender, language, country, all sorts of interesting demographics. And if I were going to do the full demo, I could show you psychographics. I could slice this up by people who like to go out, by outdoor enthusiasts, by fast food lovers, all by associating certain data fields inside Facebook together. And I can even take it a step further and infer things that aren't natively in Facebook. For instance, I can assess affluence. I can go look at where you work, where you live, where you went to school, who your friends are, what hotels you go to, and make a pretty good assessment about your level of affluence. I can do the same thing with your influence by looking at how you behave on the social network. Do your friends come to you, or do you go to them? How often do you post? If you're an influencer, perhaps I want to reach out to you. I'm running for office, and I'd like to know who my influencers are so I can get them to do some fundraising for me, and how popular you are. So that the sky's the limit, with access to ever richer consumer data sucked in by these social networks, that can be captured and analyzed and transformed in ways that create very meaningful, targeted relationships with followers of a particular organization. And as mentioned earlier, that can be used for good or bad. My personal take is this can create a very meaningful relationship between brands and their followers, a loyalty relationship where you are getting rich, relevant information from the brand in return for loyalty from the people who are following your brand. And lastly, I'll just put this up. Unfortunately, you can't see it. We did analysis just for fun of Giants fans and New England Patriots fans, given the Super Bowl this weekend, and found some interesting insights. The one you probably can't read is what's the favorite book that these different groups like. For the Patriots fans, it was Harry Potter. For the Giants fans, it was Diary of a Wimpy Kid. So hopefully that doesn't convey to the Giants over the weekend. So once again, this is a free app you can play with, wisdom.com. You should check it out just for yucks. The whole point of it is to reveal to you the wealth of data that is hidden behind the scenes within the social networks. And maybe you can put two and two together and think about how your organization, if it could capture that data, what it could do with it for a more meaningful relationship with the people who engage with your organization. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
So good afternoon. As Rob mentioned, I'm a program manager at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. And I would like to preface my remarks by saying that everything I say here this afternoon is as a private person. These are purely my own opinions. They do not represent in any way the opinions of the agency. I'm not here as an official representative. So I am legally required to say that, and so I did. And you'll hear plenty more about my opinions about legal requirements shortly. So Rob, I agree with what he said that the future is very difficult to predict. There was a famous quote, right? Prediction is very difficult, especially when it comes to the future. But there is one thing that I think I can safely predict. I really have no problems with doing this at all. And that is that as more and more of life takes place in the last speaker I heard on the last session used a fantastic term, the connected public network, or the connected public sphere, or the network public sphere, I don't remember what it was. But the more and more of life that takes place in that kind of environment, the more good things will happen and the more bad things will happen, because in real life, both good and bad things happen. So there's certainly no point in going through life, with rose-colored glasses on, especially when you know bad things and bad people are lurking out there and ready to do bad things to you. So I kind of live, I have to admit, more a little bit on the dark side of life. I mean, I lay awake at nights worrying about what really horrible things can happen to people, what really bad things people can do. And in my particular case, I'm worried about that in the context of social media. And unfortunately, there are already numerous examples of this being the case. Just to give you some of my favorites, these are things that most people don't think about, so I think it's worthwhile raising them. So a really good example, one of my favorite examples, is something called Operation Valhalla, which occurred in Iraq. And in this case, this was a few years ago. And what happened in Operation Valhalla is one of our special forces units engaged with some paramilitary organization in Iraq, good at beating up at unarmed civilians, not so good against hardened military operators. And the outcome of this was that our special forces unit killed 16 of those guys, captured 16 of those guys, freed a hostage, seized a huge weapons cache that they were sitting on, and left. Now that really sounds great, right? At least from our perspective. Seems like a successful operation, except there was one small catch. And the small catch is that the moment we vacated the scene, those guys swept in, took these 16 bodies, arranged them on prayer mats, picked up all the weapons, of course, and made it look like somebody had come in and murdered all these guys unarmed in the middle of prayers. So here they are, and what they did was they took a mobile phone, they took pictures, they pushed the pictures out into the social media space, they put out press releases in Arabic and in English that were picked up by all the press, and saying, look at these horrible Americans, what they did. They came in, they murdered these poor guys in prayer, unarmed. Right? And all of this happened before our guys got back to their base, within 45 minutes. Now, this was quick thinking. This was actually a lovely piece of work, really beautiful, I have to say. Right? The result was that the Army had to do an investigation, and during the 30-day investigation that ensued, this Special Forces unit was benched, couldn't do anything, sitting on the sidelines. So the result was that these guys who could never take the Special Forces unit in a physical fight managed to put them out of commission through social media and some quick thinking. Very nice example. There are many, many more examples like that. It's really interesting. And it happens at different scales. So another kind of entertaining example was in China, because believe me, the Chinese are not immune to this. So in China, there were some guys who thought it would be fun to create a run on rice. So during I think it was during all these meltdowns in Japan with the reactors, a word got around to say, oh, if you eat rice, you'll be protected from radiation. Or it was some kind of story like that anyway, some rumor. And it generated this huge run on rice. After a while, you couldn't buy a grain of rice in any shop in China. It was totally bogus. Okay? So, but a much larger scale, and it created a lot of havoc. So there are a lot of examples on a lot of different scales. So here's one I think is really also fun. And this is really a very personal thing, which could be done on a much larger scale. So there's a very senior military officer, extremely senior, who made the boast that, well, you know, I don't have any Facebook account, I'm not on social media, I'm okay. Nobody can get at me, right? So he told us some guys I know who then went away. They said, well, okay, that's what you claim, we'll see. So they went away, and they came back to him a little bit later, and they said, well, are you familiar with University XYZ? He said, yeah. Well, are you familiar with dormitory ABC on the campus? He said, yeah. And what about room, Alpha Beta Gamma? He says, yeah. And what about the person in that room who has mobile phone number, so? And he looked at the guy right and he says, that's my daughter. So they found this guy's daughter in a pretty short amount of time for somebody who claimed to have no presence of him or his family anywhere in the social media space. He was a little bit annoyed by that, upset. The idea of being, well, gee, if you do that to me, I mean, I have all my, all the senior military staff whose job is to prosecute actions wherever we need them prosecuted. And if they're all going to be, and they think they're safe, their families are protected, well, they go out there and do their thing, and well, they start to believe that's not the case, that all these guys can easily find them, know where to get them. What does that mean? What does that mean for our ability to do what we need to do? So it's a very, very broad range of things. I mean, I can go on all afternoon with lots of fun examples, but the problem is not to sit and whine about. I mean, the thing is not to sit and whine about. Yeah, okay, well, this is really bad, and gee, well, we're absolutely helpless. We're not helpless. There are things we can do, and we have to think about how it is we're going to handle these things. So there's no reason to give up. The problem at the moment that we need to face is that the environment is filled with contradictions. Okay. So things that a private company can do with data, so we heard lots of great things. The last speaker talked about what wonderful things you do with data. The last session the guy from Twitter said, yeah, context is really important. It's not only Twitter, but you need to take things from different kinds of sources. You need to put it together, build up a big picture. Okay, well, if I, as the United States government, say I'm going to do that, and I actually personally agree that that's what needs to be done, but if I, as the United States government, say I'm going to do that, guess what's going to happen? So some of you may have seen, for example, recently the FBI put out an RFI about, they want to build some social media monitoring system, and it generated one hell of a controversy. So if I suggest doing what I just said before, people are going to bring up the specter of, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember TIA, the DARPA TIA program, Total Information Awareness. Whatever you do, the specter of TIA comes up, right? And then you're blocked from doing anything. So basically, whatever somebody would like to try to do to protect the citizens, you have lawyers coming at you from every side, you have privacy organizations coming at you from every side, everybody's there to shut you down. Okay? Well, then what? Then you really can't do anything. While our adversaries, both nation states, criminal organizations, terrorist organizations, you name it, all over the world, have completely free hands and can do anything they like. So I don't know where that leaves us, but not in a very good position, I would suggest. And the problem is that all of our policies and rules and everything else are so far behind the curve on what needs to be done in order to deal with these issues in some kind of rational way that we don't have any time to waste. We need to get on it, and the problem is that's not really happening in any serious way. People prefer just, all the politicians say, well, yeah, this hot potato can't handle this, nobody wants this, violates privacy, we don't do anything, right? Which is fantastic because while they're saying that out of one side of their mouths, out of the other side of their mouths, they're going and talking to so-called public relations firms who run astroturfing campaigns for them. Now, for those of you who may not know the term astroturfing, I'll explain it very briefly because it's a fantastic concept. AstroTurf is fake grass, and astroturfing is a fake grassroots campaign. So politicians hire these companies, and they can go out and they can get guys who control maybe 10 bots, and open up 10,000 accounts, however, 100,000 accounts, and create a lot of chatter, make it look like a grassroots campaign in support of that politician. And they have no problem doing that privately, and publicly they say something completely different. So there's major contradictions at every turn. Now they point to the Chinese. They look at the Chinese. Look how bad guys they are. They do all kinds of really nasty things like that. So the Chinese, they talk about the Chinese 50-cent party. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Chinese 50-cent party, but the concept is actually very simple. The Chinese government, what they do is they get reliable citizens, give them some minimal amount of training, and then send them out into the Chinese social media and the space and the blogosphere. And their job is, anytime they see any kind of negative post about any part of official Chinese life, these guys jump in and they start counter-posting. Okay? The reason it's called 50-cent party is because the mythology is that for every post they did, they got paid a half a yuan, which is the Chinese currency. So people point to Chinese and say, oh yeah, they're really bad guys, that's really a bad thing to do, right? And there's claims that there are, as many as 400,000 people doing this in China who are on the payroll of the Chinese government in this way. On the other hand, in the United States today, while they say, oh, this kind of things are really bad, you see private companies starting to do exactly the same thing. And there are already several really, really interesting cases, right? So you have Dell, that's a famous case. Dell, they've trained, I don't know, I've heard estimates of 3,000 to 5,000 people. They built a social media monitoring unit at Dell. They have a university where they train people to become basically what the Chinese do, to teach them to be able to go out into the blogosphere and promote Dell. Same thing. Intel has something similar. Dell is getting ready to commoditize and package up their training system to sell to other companies because there's a lot of interest. So this kind of thing is growing. So it's growing among commercial interest, all interest except the government. So that's a little bit unfortunate. We need to do something about it. The issues need to be brought out in the open, that this is not all la-di-da. I mean, things where people go out, disaster relief and everything else is great, but every single positive use like that, I can show you, you can show me about social media. I can show you how to pervert it and do something really bad with it. Not even separate bad things, but inject bad things right into that. So, I mean, I can sit and tell you how to do that kind of thing all day long. So we need to address it, but we need to address policies that are preventing us from addressing it first. So I think with that, I will turn it over.
Is this already on? Can you hear me? Or yes? No? Yes? Okay, great, thanks. Well, on that lovely positive note, how many people here are depressed already as it is? Yeah. So it's kind of hard to... Angry and depressed. Well, maybe I can give you a bit of hope. So it's hard to go at the end of a long, fascinating day of presentations without repeating what's already been said a few hundred times, perhaps. But I'm going to try and and maybe take a slightly different approach and talk about time-critical crowdsourcing within the context of real-time awareness. And I want to start with just an example. A friend of mine, Riley Crane at MIT, who a couple of years back won this DARPA, actually, the red balloon contest. How many people here are familiar with that red balloon? Yeah, okay, most people. So basically, DARPA put out 10 balloons across the continental US, and then basically created this challenge. Okay, which team can come up with the location of these 10 balloons? And it happens that my good friend Riley was part of the winning team and identified the location of these 10 balloons in under 9 hours without ever leaving their laptops, right? It was purely leveraging social media and then using some smart recursive incentive mechanisms so that people would get paid for the value of their contribution to identifying the location of one or more of these red balloons. So here you have something pretty amazing because it really is a needle in the haystack kind of challenge, right? The surface area of the US is something like 3.7 million square miles, and you have these balloons that are sort of like 8 feet sort of diameter. So to do this in under 9 hours without moving from your seat, simply thinking about how you can leverage social media and crowdsourcing is pretty phenomenal. Now, when Riley and company at MIT were celebrating their victory, and before I got to that, actually, they had basically recruited something like 4,000 volunteers to begin with to help sort of identify the location of these balloons. In any case, so they were rewarded for their contributions. But a few minutes away from MIT at the Fletcher School, around the same time, some students were very busy combing through the social media space right after the earthquake that struck Haiti. They were looking through Twitter, through Facebook, also online sort of news, mainstream media, and looking for actionable information that they could add to a Haiti crisis map that was run on a platform called Ushahidi. What's remarkable about this is this was a bunch of volunteers who'd never really done anything like this before, just manually going through the social media space and looking for these relevant pieces of information and then mapping it. And then we found out a week or two later that the US Marine Corps and the US Coast Guard were using this content operationally, literally to go and send out the choppers to evacuate people. Now, what made that possible as well was that there was another initiative that was launched, which allowed people in Haiti to text in their most urgent needs and their locations. So we were crowdsourcing micro needs assessments from the disaster-affected population using a free SMS shortcode that was then translated via crowdsourcing, thanks to the Haitian diaspora, from Haitian Creole to English and geolocated, and also added to this Haiti crisis map. So we were getting more information, I would argue, that was actionable than perhaps the professional humanitarian community was. So here you have another example of several hundred volunteers, ordinary volunteers, getting together, leveraging crowdsourcing, social media, to literally save hundreds of lives. That's exactly what the US Marine Corps told us in a follow-up email. We used your platform every second of every day, and it helped us save hundreds of lives. We never left Boston. We were in the living room, and it was snowing, and that's what we were able to do by leveraging the power of social media, open source, and crowdsourcing. Last year, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, so the main body that's responsible for coordinating humanitarian response operations for the UN system, got in touch with us and said, this was as Libya was starting to explode, we need a live map. We need a live crowdsourced social media map of Libya. We don't have any of our information management officers in Libya. We don't know what's happening. We obviously cannot trust the news coming out of Libya from the state-run sort of news agencies. But we know from the Arab Spring and everything that's happened in Egypt and Tunisia that there's a bunch of information floating around this social media space that they weren't really very familiar with: Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Flickr, and so on. So they asked us to create this live map, which we did, and which informed their own situational awareness, gave them the kind of real-time situational awareness that they needed to start, within the context of other data, taking decisions, multi-million-dollar decisions on how to allocate their humanitarian relief operations. So who was behind this map? Again, it was a bunch of volunteers from a group called the Standby Volunteer Task Force. This is a group of volunteers from around the world, about 80 different countries now, 750 volunteers, I think, as of this week, who have been trained in doing this kind of live mapping operations for various humanitarian organizations, such as UN OCHA, but also WHO, UNHCR, and human rights groups as well. They do this completely for free because they're passionate, because they want to make a difference, they want to help. So here we are, giving you a few examples in the US, Haiti, and Libya of real-time or time-critical crowdsourcing for humanitarian response using free open source technologies, social media, and so on and so forth. Now, what you might have noticed from these different examples is the number of volunteers that were required to actually do this. One of the reasons why we needed and still need so many volunteers is because of some of these curation tools or automated natural language processing, event extraction, machine learning tools are actually not accessible to the average normal person, believe it or not. Like, there's some really fancy, sophisticated, and I'm sure very powerful tools in the private sector, maybe in DARPA, but that's definitely classified and it's not open to the average person outside those particular walls, certainly not to us within the Standby Volunteer Task Force, which, again, we spend a lot of time doing this for free, and we're just doing this manually. So we're doing real-time manual crowdsourcing of crisis information that humanitarian organizations can then use operationally. So what I'd love to see, and I use this time as an invitation to some of these partners and colleagues in the room to maybe share with us some of your tools, at least let us test run them, because we're pretty darn good at doing real-time crisis crowdsourcing and live mapping. This is why humanitarian organizations partner with us as often as they do. We'd love to be able to actually scale a bit more. We're 700 volunteers, but okay, we're growing, but we know that some of these solutions that you've developed exist. We'd love to try at least test run them and see how they work for us and perhaps come up with some arrangement where ordinary volunteers can help save lives by using your platform. So I'd love to, this is an open invitation. Email me at patrick@ushahidi.com, or after the break, I'd love to chat. One thing I'd say, though, in terms of the presentations that I've seen, just to close up my presentation and maybe part of the day here, with respect to NLP and machine learning and so on, go back to what Robert Kirkpatrick said this morning, referencing Ed Jazierski, the idea of not just looking at machine learning and automated natural language processing, but also leveraging the wisdom of the crowds and then the instinct of the experts. So a lot of these tools are very sophisticated on the automated machine learning front. But I'd like to see something more focused on collaboration, because that's a lot of what we're all about with the Standby Volunteer Task Force, is collaboration. Right now, if I'm sitting behind Twitter, my laptop, alone in my room, I'm on my own trying to curate the Twitter sphere, right? But I have 700 other friends who are online who could help me curate that Twitter sphere. So I want to see crowdsourcing and collaborative platforms that allow me to crowdsource the filter of this fire hose, so that I get a dedicated stream of data that's relevant. And not only that, once I have this stream, I want a collaborative platform that will allow me to crowdsource the curation of this particular stream as well. I have not seen enough, I think, focus on that collaborative element. It's been a lot tech, but the human element, as you can see from the examples I've just shared with you of the Standby Task Force, can do a whole lot. But I think with some of your tools and mixing automated with human curation collaborative platforms, we can scale. We can be involved in multiple emergencies at the same time and get information to humanitarians, to local affected populations faster and more reliably as well. Thank you very much.
Questions and have answers from the audience. Patrick, to kind of stir things, getting things going here a little bit first. We heard in the last panel there were questions about crisis response, particularly first responder response. Red Cross was an example. As information comes in from social media, the question was, how do we ensure quality control? How do we ensure authoritative sourcing if somebody's life is going to be on the line? You referenced Marines or others going in to rescue people. How do you go about quality control and make sure the data is authoritative?
That's a really good question, and it's been a recurring theme, I think, throughout the day. There were a couple of panels that addressed this. So what we have within the Standby Task Force is different teams. We have one team that's fully dedicated to verifying information. That's all they do. That's their whole purpose and raison d'etre, is to basically the information that the media monitoring team provides, they have to try their best to verify it. I tweeted earlier this morning on my Patrick Meier Twitter handle a 20-page strategy document that I published and authored and posted in my blog post on how to verify crowdsourced information from the social media space. This particular 20-pager has gotten a lot of attention from Al Jazeera, from the UK Guardian, from the BBC, because a lot of them are struggling with some of these same challenges. So yes, it may seem at first blush that it's impossible to make sense of this data stream, or rather this fire hose, this torrent of information, and there are these countless anonymous sort of voices out there. How are we going to trust anybody? Actually, it's not impossible. There's some really smart things that Al Jazeera and the UK Guardian have developed in terms of, and the BBC have developed into strategies and tactics to verify, triangulate information that's out there. So I invite you to have a look at this 20-page paper. They're based on actual case studies. Andy Carvin is one of them. And to provide feedback and to build on this particular strategy guide, because we've got to get more and more sophisticated. It is about, in a way, a form of media literacy that we're lagging. We're not that media literate and understanding how to really make use of the social media information. So there's a lot of education and learning that needs to happen. So again, it's not impossible, it's challenging. There's definitely pressure when we talk about crises, and there's this time element. But also, let's not forget that the only source of information is from the social media. Absolutely not, right? It's not only about crowdsourcing. You can use other forms of information collection sort of methods that are going to be giving you certain advantages, maybe more trustworthiness, but it's going to have certain disadvantages. And the idea is simply to mix and match whatever is best for you depending on the particular problem. So that's fine.
Any questions from the audience yet? Sir?
Nelson from the Help Earth Foundation. What I'm hearing today, it seems like we're come to this great divide in America, and I see it in the emergency response all the time, whether it's a competency level or a funding level. And if emergency response is really turning from a top-down to a bottom-up structure, do we need to set up a public safety cloud? So we have small jurisdictions or large jurisdictions. If they get wiped out, like in Japan, if an EOC is gone, then you can't get anything going. So is it the responsibility of the government and the big cloud service providers? Because all of the social media is on the cloud, and it is allowing them to scale up. But when we are trying to help the people, we are not using the same tools. And it seems like we need a bigger movement, a public safety cloud, if it were.
Patrick?
That's not my area.
Well, disaster response, disaster relief. I think one of the things that I was at DHS for several years in preparedness, and if you think about things like ready.gov, which is clearly embryonic, and with the things that we heard from Craig Fugate this morning, I think they're still lagging behind where we'd like to be. I do think that at least now we've got a shared understanding of the things that could be done. So I would ask you a question, Patrick, that relates to this one. Agencies such as FEMA or USGS or the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency that briefed earlier today that does humanitarian relief, have you had opportunities to work with them? Have they reached out to you or you to them?
Yes, some. I mean, NGAs. So what's happened in this humanitarian, new humanitarian actors, new humanitarian spaces, the rise of so-called volunteer and technical communities, VTCs for short, where you have these volunteer networks that sort of spring up during crises to support or take the lead and try and help in any way they can. So what's happened in the past year or two is actually, in a way, a rapprochement between these nebulous, volunteer, anonymous kind of networks that at first frightened the professional humanitarian organizations. And now what we're actually seeing is more and more collaboration between these different organizations. OCHA reaching out proactively to define a way to basically collaborate. How do you have top-down, formal, traditional humanitarian organizations interface with these more decentralized, hybrid kind of networks? And there's been a lot of work that's been going on over the past especially 6 months now, to bring these different actors together. And NGA's been part of the conversation as well in some recent conferences in Geneva. FEMA, on and off, not as much. It's Red Cross definitely as well. So we do get more and more humanitarian organizations that come to hear about us, and us being the Standby Volunteer Task Force, and say, oh, we saw what you did with UNHCR in Somalia. We'd like to do this in Madagascar, for example. So, but you know, we're going to get more and more demand, I think, from different groups who are looking for, in a way, free sort of support, and skilled, by the way, very skilled free support. So that's one of the reasons why I made this plug for, you know, help us with your tools so that we can help disaster-affected population.
Sir? You, sir, right in the front row.
So Alex Howard, O'Reilly Media. One of the challenges that I think we're facing as a world right now is that the social media platforms that we've been discussing are largely owned by private companies. In fact, perhaps all, right? From YouTube to Flickr to Twitter to Facebook, which is about to go public and become a public company, which is to say public on an exchange, not public as in we own it unless you want to share. We all know Mark Zuckerberg owns most of it. The question, though, that I have for you is if you look ahead, which is, I thought, the premise of the panel, will there be a point where we'll see different kinds of social networks which are more owned by the people instead of companies? Which is to say, will we go back to this kind of lighter weight, more distributed internet that I grew up in the early 90s where people set up a web server, and then FTP their files to it and own the code and own the infrastructure to some extent? Or will we be outsourcing our presences, the public square itself, to private companies with all the attendant challenges, as referenced earlier with respect to how Twitter is now censoring country-specific information. In fact, Google now is with Blogger as well.
But I think you're probably closest to from the telecommunications. So I was mentioning, if we can come to a place, and I think many localities are moving in this direction, where the broadband communications access becomes ubiquitous and free. You get a drink of water out of a water fountain, you're not being charged from that by the city municipality. If you can have that kind of access, that's certainly a key enabler to begin to move towards what you're describing, Lou.
Yeah, in all honesty, it's not straight up my alley with what you're describing. At this juncture, to be honest, it's hard for me to imagine with the momentum behind some of these privately owned social networks that they will say, give way or kind of fade away into something that becomes maybe a public owned or kind of public generated social network. So it's really hard to say. I think I don't have any particular insight into it for you, to be honest.
So one thing is, at the end of the day, somebody's got to pay for it.
Yeah.
So the question is, who's going to pay for it? And if you look at the history of the internet, I mean, starting from the ARPANET from the 60s and all the way, until the end of the 80s when the ARPANET was officially closed down and the internet came into being, the trend has been more and more towards commercial interests simply because somebody had to pay. And at the end of the day, unless you can find a way to finance the whole thing, which doesn't depend on somebody being able to monetize it, the thing that you're asking about can't happen. And you're going to end up with, 2 or 3 guys who decide all the policies. I mean, right now, Facebook has like 90% of the business in that kind of area. And, and the types of communications and the way they happen is very heavily dependent on types of policies they have. So if Mark Zuckerberg gets up on the wrong side of the bed one day and says, you know what, I think the way this is being run sucks, I'm going to change the rules, he could just do it. So what? What are you going to do about it? So he changes the rules, and then it makes a corresponding change to the way people communicate with each other and do everything they do. So personally, I find that situation unacceptable. But until somebody's going to be willing to step up and say, okay, here's how we're going to finance this, nothing will change.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Alex. That's a really good question. At the same time, there is a free and open source movement. There is an open data movement, and I think we're going to see, this is my bias. I hope that we're going to see more and more alternatives spring up because of some of the limitations that you described. These platforms, curation, NLP platforms are highly proprietary, they're extremely expensive, they're classified, so they're not accessible to the wider sort of public. So, and us at Ushahidi, being a free and open source open data type organization, we're hoping to also get involved in developing these kind of curation tools. But again, free and open source, so we can actually democratize the ability to make sense of this fire hose, that everybody can have this kind of shared awareness, and not just a few elite individuals who can actually afford it. So and once some of these open source platforms are out there, the hope is that people will, like we saw with Linux and so on, improve it, add to it, and then you have something maybe comparable a few years down the road to the proprietary, very expensive classified system. So this idea of the rise of open source intelligence, I don't think it's something that's going to end anytime soon. At least that's my bias, I hope.
Thank you. My name is Lorelei Kelly. I'm presently working on creating a distributed system of expertise for Congress. I have a question, and perhaps you, Patrick, could answer this best. One of the things I've noticed working on the Hill and in the United States is the narrative function of a political space in crisis. And what I've paid attention to here especially is the rise of Islamophobic narratives after terrorist incidents. And there is nobody taking explicit responsibility for kind of the common good outcome that tamps down fear and sort of a contagious ideological response. You can see this just over the last 2 years in the near misses, the Times Square, Portland, Oregon, the airport incidents, Fort Hood, and who has been the most consistent in calming up with a public common good narrative has actually been the U.S. Army. I mean, this was true with the Quran. It took General Petraeus. This was true with, Barack Hussein Obama and him being a Christian and not a Muslim. It took Colin Powell. And I feel like this is a big piece of crisis response that's missing. Do you ever assign this task of common good narrative? It follows on sort of Alex's question about who owns this at the end. This non-commercial, non-conflict of interest, monetarily common good idea that we're all in this together. It seems to be a natural follow-on to what you do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I like the idea a lot, to basically magnify the good rather than just all the bad things that are happening in many ways, and to basically pick out those narratives that are healthy narratives, let's just say, and to make them have more visibility and sort of amid all the other maybe hate speech and so on that's going on. So you're asking whether this is something we might do with part of the Standby Task Force, for example, to sort of...
Yeah, I mean, it seems like in this country, it's not also a healthy, it's great that the military is a fabulous public service, but they shouldn't be the ones doing this. It should be a civilian leadership responsibility or a citizen public square, town square, very human interaction.
Right.
It's the elders in the community. It's always tactical in the United States. It's the first responders. It should be the mayors. Does this make sense? It's
Yeah,
not
it does.
tactical.
I mean,
It's a governing problem.
So there may be a few, isolated instances of people in the military doing that, but I can assure you that if that became a habit, they would be shut down pretty fast. I mean, 1 or 2 instances, yeah, maybe, but if that's was started repeating, they're going to have a huge problem, and they will be shut down, and there won't be anybody in the United States government who can pick up the slack, really, because as soon as you do, then everybody's going to bring out the Smith-Mundt Act, and they're going to bring out this and the other one, and you're going to be out of business. So unless it's a private initiative that's ready to take it up, it won't happen. I don't think.
At the same time, there are fewer barriers abroad, internationally. So a lot of the work that we've been doing, say, in Kenya, would be very difficult to do in a place like Chicago because of all the regulations and so on. So we're able to do good in Kenya because the regulations are not as strict and have positive impact, social impact using ICTs and so on. But and this is actually, I'm referring to the Peace Text project that we've been involved in. We've struggled in Chicago because of all kinds of regulations to use SMS to basically try and prevent gun-related violence. In Kenya, we can actually do the SMS broadcast and change behaviors and so on. So there's this whole regulation that's a problem here and then in Western Europe as well.
Of course, the way to do it is to sit in Kenya and broadcast it to the United States.
There you go.
Well, that's ultimately what's going to happen. I mean, look, that's what happened with all these gambling sites and all kind of thing. I mean, that's just the natural course of events. If people can't go this way, they're going to go that way, ultimately.
So in honor, or to keep track time here, sir, you're the last question.
I appreciate it. My name is Kaushal Jala, and I work at the World Bank Innovation Unit. My team is tasked with working on maps and increasingly towards how citizens can be part of the development conversation and also lead the development conversation. I've known Patrick and a lot of few people in this room for a while, but one of the things I really like about the task force is how quickly the community comes together. But my question to, I guess, the panel is how do we create that kind of engagement around development challenges? Because development challenges require long-term commitment. You know, some of the strongest digital communities have long-term engagement, just like if you look at Wikipedia. You know, that's when you create a knowledge of wealth, that's when you create a knowledge of understanding. So if you take the example of Haiti, or you take some of the places where we work in, like the DRC, like, you know, I mean, I could go through a list of countries, and you look at the poverty numbers. More people die out of poverty. You know, more mothers lose their lives in, you know, at birth, giving birth rather, and more children pass away than any violence could bring on them, right? So how do we get volunteer communities more engaged? You know, maybe in a digital sense, more maybe in an offline sense, but to create a consistent conversation in the public domain. You know, that's one of the challenges we're facing. And we're seeing more of the adoption of tools in some middle-income countries like Indonesia and India, of Facebook and Twitter, but it's not as prevalent in places where we work, you know, where most of our portfolio sits. So but we recognize that we're moving towards a world. So that's the question.
Well, I think it's actually kind of funny you say that, because I lived in Sweden for 17 years in Stockholm.
Actually, the question was put to me by Hans Rosling. So Hans Rosling's like, it's great you're doing this, Haiti, but more kids have died in the year than you would ever lose in the earthquake. So it was like, okay, you know, I'm telling him about the volunteer task force. I'm telling him about what's happening whenever there's an earthquake and a fire. So it's interesting you mentioned Sweden. So.
Well, so in Sweden, so the reason I bring up Sweden is because Sweden is a place where nobody volunteers for anything. No, I'm not kidding. Volunteerism is it's not okay. The government is supposed to take care of everything, not the citizens. That's why we pay taxes out the rear end. They should do all the work we paid for it, and that's it. So Swedes don't really do anything. And what you read is that in the United States, volunteerism, I mean, you read the average number of hours that lots of people volunteer for all kinds of things is like enormous compared to the rest of the entire world. So if you want to build communities like that, that's what you play on. So the spirit of volunteerism, it already exists. People have an emotional buy-in to volunteerism all over the country. And you play on that emotion to bring people together. I mean, you know, it's the same thing. You can look at people, you know, who bring people with strong emotions but negative emotions together, and they do this. It's the same technique. So, if you talk about really how you do it, I mean, look at the National Defense League in England. Right? That's a good example. Started out, this is a really extremist, right-wing, you know, anti-immigrant organization. Started out with a handful of people, maybe 50 people, and in a relatively short time grew to over 100,000 active followers. And they all found each other through social media. But it all played on very strong emotion and emotional reactions. And you use exactly the same type of technique throughout the United States to organize volunteer networks.
So focus on the drivers. Like, what are the incentives to volunteer?
No, but you see, they already have the incentives. They're already oriented towards volunteering. They do it all the time. And it's not, you know, it's really hard to sell something to somebody that they don't know they want or they don't want. It's a lot easier to tell somebody something which basically they really want. So that's the same thing with the volunteerism. You just play on the existing, you know, orientation towards doing that. And there's lots to build on in the United States for that.
Thanks for the question. The panelists will be around. We've got the email. You can get to them. I'm sure all of us would appreciate your thoughts afterwards. We want to stay on track for the next speaker. Thanks for your interest today. Good work. Excellent.
Thank you, sir.